There is an unwritten rule among late-night analog broadcast engineers that is passed down to every new technician during their first week on the graveyard shift. Never look directly at a dead channel for more than 3 minutes. When a television station cuts its primary transmission feed at 3 in the morning and transitions to the standard black and white static snow, the television screen isn't actually empty. It is displaying a chaotic mosaic of cosmic background radiation, the residual microscopic heat signature of the creation of the universe itself, mixed with the stray electromagnetic interference of the atmosphere. The human brain is a biological pattern recognition machine. If you force it to stare into that completely random, rushing sea of white noise for too long in an empty room, the mind will eventually reject the chaos. It will bridge the gaps between the flickering pixels, smoothing the static out into shapes, faces, and frequencies that were never meant to be decoded by a human eye. My name is Nicholas, and for 12 years I worked as a master control operator for an independent UHF television station in southwestern Pennsylvania. The station, WCV Channel 14, was a relic of a bygone broadcasting era. Located in a low, windowless concrete bunker at the base of our 300-foot transmission tower on an isolated ridgeline, the facility was completely bypassed by modern digital technology. While major network affiliates transitioned to automated satellite feeds and fiber optic pipelines, Channel 14 still relied on massive, roaring quadplex magnetic tape decks, manual patch bays, and high-voltage vacuum tube transmitters that required constant human adjustment to keep the signal from drifting off the frequency. My shift ran from midnight until 8 o'clock in the morning. For the first 3 hours, my job was to monitor the automated playback of old syndicated reruns, low-budget local commercials, and public access programming. But at exactly 3:15, the programming schedule officially ended. My primary responsibility was to sign the station off the air, cut the main studio feed, and switch the transmitter over to a low-power test pattern until the morning news crew arrived at 6. It was a lonely, deeply repetitive routine, conducted in a room lined with green carpeted walls, the only sound being the deep, 60 Hz hum of the high-voltage equipment racks and the rhythmic click of the master clock on the wall. It was during a bitterly cold, foggy Tuesday morning in early January when the static began to organize itself. The time was exactly 3:47. I had completed the station sign-off checklist 15 minutes prior, transitioning the main broadcast feed to the standard SMPTE color bars and a continuous 1 kHz audio tone. I was sitting at the master control desk, reviewing the transmitter logbook, when the audio monitor directly above my head abruptly cut out. The piercing, continuous tone didn't just fade, it snapped into a sudden, deep acoustic vacuum that made the air inside the control room feel instantly heavy. I looked up at the primary broadcast monitor, a massive 24-inch heavy glass cathode ray tube television that displayed the live signal currently leaving our tower. The colorful test bars were gone. The screen was completely filled with a dense, hyper-accelerated pattern of black and white static snow that was rushing across the glass with a violent, chaotic energy. I reached out and tapped the glass screen, thinking a coaxial cable behind the console had vibrated loose. The static didn't flicker. Instead, the white noise through the control room speakers began to drop in pitch, shifting from a sharp, metallic hiss into a low, guttural roar that sounded exactly like the ocean tide rushing through a hollow concrete tunnel. I pulled up the system diagnostic interface on my auxiliary console to check the transmitter output power. The readings were impossible. The high-voltage tubes weren't drawing power from the local electrical grid, they were exhibiting a massive negative power feedback loop. The transmission tower outside wasn't broadcasting a signal into the valley. It was acting as a massive 300-foot iron antenna, drawing an immense, concentrated stream of electromagnetic energy down from the upper atmosphere and forcing it directly into the master control room's hardware. As I reached for the main high-voltage circuit breaker to cut power to the entire facility, a visual anomaly manifested on the glass surface of the broadcast monitor. The random white pixels began to slow down their movement, grouping together into tight, geometric lines that formed a series of concentric squares in the center of the screen. The image resembled a deep, spinning tunnel constructed out of pure television interference. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes locked onto the center of the static vortex. That was when the screen began to broadcast a live video feed. The footage was captured in a low-resolution monochrome format that matched the gray aesthetic of the white noise. It showed the interior of a room. I looked at the walls, the equipment racks, and the master control console visible in the frame. A violent jolt of adrenaline surged through my chest, making my hands turn ice cold. The monitor was displaying a live, real-time camera angle of the exact control room I was currently sitting in. The camera position was situated from a high, impossible vantage point directly inside the ceiling ventilation duct behind my chair. I turned around instantly, shining my flashlight beam up toward the metal slats of the intake vent. The dark air duct was completely empty, the old dust on the grate undisturbed. Yet when I looked back at the glass screen, the monochrome figure sitting in the master control chair turned its head in perfect synchronization with my movement. The video wasn't a recording. It was a live spatial reflection, but the details inside the screen were subtly, terrifyingly wrong. The monochrome version of the control room visible on the television screen was completely stripped of its modern components. The green carpeted walls were bare, raw concrete, covered in deep vertical fractures that showed no sign of structural rebar. The modern logging computers were gone, replaced by rows of ancient, open chassis vacuum tube arrays that were glowing with a fierce, unstable white light. And the figure sitting in my chair, the entity that possessed my exact clothing, my hair, and my physical build, didn't have a human face. Where its features should have been, there was an open, circular void of pure, churning broadcast static. The black and white pixels were rushing across the surface of its head with a frantic, liquid speed, spilling out over the collar of its shirt like a cloud of radioactive ash. As I watched the screen in absolute, paralyzed horror, the faceless entity slowly raised its hand, pointing a single, long gray finger directly at the glass panes separating our realities. The speakers on the master console erupted with a sound that made my ears ring. The low roar of the white noise stopped, replaced by a human voice broadcasting with a crystalline, high-fidelity resonance that made the glass of the television tube vibrate. The voice belonged to me. It was an exact, flawless acoustic replica of my own vocal print, but the delivery was entirely mechanical, devoid of any natural human cadence, inflection, or warmth. It spoke in a flat, rhythmic monotone, listing a sequence of broadcast maintenance codes that had been decommissioned by the Federal Communications Commission 40 years ago. Sign-off complete. Carrier wave locked, initiating the blank channel transition. The heavy steel entry door to the master control bunker behind my back suddenly clicked. The mechanical lock mechanism didn't slide open. The internal brass tumblers simply fused together with a sharp, high-voltage pop that smelled of burning copper and melted plastic. The digital security pad next to the frame died, its indicator light shifting from a healthy green to a solid, dead gray. I was sealed inside the concrete bunker, 3 floors beneath the ridgeline, completely out of range of any cellular telephone towers. I grabbed a heavy iron patch cable from the storage rack, swinging the thick metal connector with all my force against the front of the primary broadcast monitor. I expected the heavy glass tube to shatter, imploding under the vacuum pressure and cutting the video loop. The iron connector struck the center of the screen with a deafening metallic crash. The glass didn't break. The surface of the television screen felt soft, viscous, and cold, yielding to the impact like a sheet of industrial silicone before snapping back into its perfect, rounded shape. The voice through the speakers began to count up from 0. With every integer it read aloud, the physical environment inside the real control room began to lose its material density. When the voice reached 10, the green carpet on the walls began to dissolve, the fabric peeling away into thin gray lines of digital static that drifted through the air like burnt paper. When the voice reached 20, the heavy wooden desk beneath my hands began to shift its atomic structure, the solid oak wood grain fatting into a transparent wireframe pattern that hummed with a low-frequency electrical charge. By the time the count reached 40, the air inside the room had turned intensely cold and dry, smelling heavily of ozone, old dust, and the stale air of a deep subterranean tomb. My breathing became shallow, the oxygen levels in the room dropping rapidly as the high-voltage equipment racks consumed the atmosphere, converting the air into a highly ionized cloud that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. I fell to my knees on the concrete floor, my hands clamping over my ears to shut out the sound of my own voice, but the countdown was no longer originating from the console speakers. The signal was vibrating directly through the bones of my skull, echoing inside my middle ear with a crushing acoustic pressure that made my vision blur into a uniform shade of gray. The voice reached 50. The glass screen of the primary monitor suddenly expanded outward, the convex tube stretching into a massive, circular lens of pure white light that flooded the entire control room with a blinding, monochromatic glare. The physical boundaries of the bunker walls vanished completely, swallowed by an immense, featureless void of absolute white noise that seemed to stretch out for infinity in every direction. I wasn't sitting in a room anymore. I was suspended in the center of a dead channel, a biological artifact trapped inside the carrier wave of a forgotten frequency. The countdown stopped at 60. The blinding glare instantly receded, snapping back into a sharp, narrow point of green light in the center of a pitch-black screen. I felt a sudden, violent sensation of physical deceleration, as if my body had been dropped from a terrifying height and slammed into a dense, unyielding medium that completely absorbed the momentum of my fall. When I finally opened my eyes, the master control room was bright. The golden light of a crisp, winter morning was streaming through the high windows of the station's main office lobby upstairs. I was sitting perfectly upright in the master control chair, my hands resting flat against the gray laminate trim of the main desk. The primary broadcast monitor in front of me was displaying a beautiful, crystal-clear color feed of the morning network news broadcast. The audio meters were bouncing healthily in the green zone, and the transmitter logs on my terminal showed an absolutely flawless, uninterrupted night of broadcasting without a single signal degradation or technical anomaly. The shift was over. The morning technician arrived at 8, carrying a travel mug of coffee and complaining about the traffic on the bridge as he took over the logging terminal. The automated station records showed that WCV Channel 14 had maintained perfect compliance with all federal broadcast standards throughout the night. There was no record of a power surge, no record of a locked door, and no record of a signal deviation. The station management told me I had experienced a severe episode of sensory deprivation-induced sleep paralysis, a well-documented neurological phenomenon where the brain enters a rapid eye-movement dreaming state while the body remains awake, often triggered by the monotonous environment of a quiet, dark control room and the continuous hum of high-voltage electronics. They recommended a week of daytime shifts, gave me a corporate voucher for an outpatient sleep study, and assured me that my standing with the company was completely unblemished. I want to believe their explanations. I want to accept that the faceless entity, the wireframe desk, and the sound of my own voice listing obsolete broadcast codes were nothing more than the vivid, defensive fabrications of an exhausted mind struggling against the night shift. But I haven't been back inside a television station since that morning. I walked out of the building at 8:15, left my master keys on the supervisor's desk, and walked away from the broadcasting industry forever. I took a job as a forestry surveyor in the deep, unmonitored wilderness of the Appalachian forests, a place where there are no power lines, no antennas, and no electronic frequencies to warp the air. I thought I had managed to pull myself out of the pattern. I thought I had left the dead channel behind on that isolated ridgeline in Pennsylvania. But 2 days ago, I was sitting alone in my small log cabin, watching the winter sun set over the jagged, tree-lined horizon. The evening was perfectly quiet. The natural silence of the mountains offering the deep peace I had been searching for. Suddenly, the small battery-operated weather radio sitting on my kitchen counter abruptly cut out. The steady, comforting voice of the automated meteorological broadcast didn't just fade. It snapped into a sudden, deep acoustic vacuum that made the air inside my cabin feel instantly cold and dry. I walked over to the radio, my hand trembling as I reached out to check the frequency dial. The small digital display was clear of all numbers. It wasn't showing a channel and it wasn't showing a low battery warning. The screen was displaying a single line of stark, pixelated characters that read, "Carrier wave locked, resuming countdown at 61." The small speaker didn't emit static. It began to broadcast the distinct, low-frequency roar of an ocean tide rushing through a concrete tunnel, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic click of a master station clock ticking away the seconds in the dark behind my walls. They aren't done with the transmission, and the channel is still waiting for me to sign off for the final time.